minutes, replay as advised.
Thanks for giving us your time again for the Valley's people. Today we have two more fascinating people from the Hunter Valley. The first is a man from Wallsend who's grown orchids for over 50 years. And then a professor from Newcastle who knows more about death than most other people living. I hope you can stay with us for today's Valley's people. Welcome back to the Valley's people. My first guest today is a man that once you start talking about orchids in the Hunter Valley, you immediately think of George Rundle. And we have him in a different pose today because I don't think many people have seen him dressed like this. George Rundle, welcome to the Valley's people.
Thanks, Ron.
50 years as a champion orchid grower. That's really something to your credit, isn't it? And I guess it really goes outside the Hunter Valley because in Australia-wide, people would regard you as maybe the leading orchid grower and something we can be proud of.
Yes.
I'm told by some of your friends who may no longer be your friends after I tell the story, they tell me that during your army days, all you ever wanted to do was take a pack of cards out of your kit bag, go into a corner of the tent or the barracks and look at them. That's fascinated me, that. Can you tell me about that story?
Well, in those early days, we had a card system, like a file. And we used to make out a card for each plant. Where on that we'd have where we bought the plant from, what price we paid for it, the colour of it, the formation of it, and it was a complete history of every plant. Well, I could go through those cards one after another. All of a sudden I'd get to one that would interest me, and the whole story of the purchasing of that plant would come back to me. The whole story.
So apart from being an army bandsman, you spent most of the war looking at the tree of your plants.
Yes, that's right.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yes.
Were you always a loner like that when it came to plants, Georgia?
Well, yes. I've had two very good friends that I could always talk to about plants, but as far as plants are concerned, I get up amongst the plants. I don't want anybody else or anything else. I've got complete satisfaction. I think I've found the one thing in life that matters, and that's contentment. When I get up amongst the orchids, I'm peaceful and contented, and I'm satisfied with my lot. I don't want anything else in the world to make my life full and happy.
Well, there aren't too many people who could say that.
No, that's right.
But when you are amongst the plants, does your mind ever go back to your first botany lesson? When did you start to get interested?
Well, my first botany lesson, I'm afraid, go back a long time. It was rather a strange one. I didn't take it as a lesson then. But the first lesson I think that most of us get in botany is when we stand up in Sunday school and sing to the top of our voices, all things bright and beautiful, all things great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Now, I've based my growing on that. I believe that every plant has got a place where it's meant to be. Now, if we're going to grow that plant, we've got to imitate the conditions that that plant grew under. Otherwise, it can't grow.
So your philosophy is that the Lord at the time of creation...
That's right. That's my philosophy, that some plants are made to stand here and some are made to stand there, right through the piece. And that's why, that's the balance of nature throughout the world. We can take it in birds, animals, plants, anything. If there were no balance, the giant sequoias of California, the giant redwoods, would take over the whole country.
Right.
But then There's the vines and the creepers and the foliage plants that grow underneath. Now the Lord's made that those plants can't get out of their environment. Otherwise they'd have covered the whole world. It's the same with animal life. You take the lion, he breeds about every 5 years. The rabbits breed about every 2 months. And this is how the world, it's the great geometrical example for everybody to know the balance of this world.
Well, what happens when George Rundle comes along and crosses one plant with the other and upsets the entire system?
Well, he can only cross within the genera. Now, he can cross 2 or 3 different ones. But let me tell you this. Now, we've got dogs and cats running around all over. There's, go out to a farm and you'll see cows and horses all in the one paddock. You go out a little bit farther and you'll see kangaroos and sheep.
Right.
But you never see a hybrid between those two. The Lord's made that everything keeps within its bounty.
And you apply that to orchids?
This is nature. I apply that to everything. I apply that to my orchids.
Well, how did you start in this road to becoming the biggest orchid grower in the Hunter Valley?
Well, first of all, I used to go in for garden competitions. I won the footpath and front garden competition 2 years running. And I used to have a little glass house there that I used to grow my seedlings in from the garden. And all I wanted was 2 plants, one to put each at the 2 glass windows facing out. I thought that'd be lovely to have 2 orchids there. I had read about them in books. And of course I purchased those 2 and they flowered for me. And of course one led to another and one led to another. And then one time a Mr. Edward Cooper, he's one of the world's leading authorities on orchids, he came out from Sanders in England. And when he came to Newcastle, he was up here for 2 or 3 days to see the different growers. Some of them were away, they were railway men. So I asked him to stay with me. We got to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning. We stood talking. He's the most interesting man I've ever met in my life. And he taught me a terrific amount. And this is one of the things that he taught me. Follow whatever guide you get.
Yes.
And the guide I get is from, as I said before, they're a natural born thing for a certain... Everything in life has its objects. A plant's object is to reproduce its own kind. Now, we look to them to grow flowers. They can't produce seed without they produce flowers. And we've got to give them the correct amount of sunlight, the correct amount of water to produce those flowers.
And then do you just rely on the bees or does something else come in?
No. Orchids have all got to be hand-pollinated. The bees can't pollinate orchids. There are some. You see, there are different insects throughout the world that are called in for different types of colours. Some colours attract them. Some formation attracts them. Now, we have an orchid from Africa, Angrecium sesquiloquade. It has a 15-inch spur runs down the bottom of it. When Livingstone saw this plant, he said, somewhere in Africa, we'll find a moth with a 15-inch proboscis. And they did. And this has proved my theory all the time. The world's the most perfectly balanced place. Everything that anything requires it, including man, is on this earth.
Yeah, it strikes me, George, that you've never really set out to, even though you are such a great exponent on orchids, you've never really set out to win a lot of awards nationally.
No.
You have a lot of Newcastle Show awards.
Yes.
Not so much else.
I've never bothered going down to Sydney showing. There's a lot of work involved in showing. You've got to, well, if you're showing cymbidiums, you've got to have the flowers spaced correctly and all this sort of thing. I like to let things grow natural. But then, if you're showing in Sydney, you've got to take the plant down, leave it down there for 3 or 4 days, then go and pick it up and bring it back. I don't think that's worth it. I was never a pot hunter.
I noticed, though, that you've got a great achievement there on your
Oh,
lapel.
yes.
Life member of the Newcastle Orchid
That's
Society.
something I'm very proud of.
I could imagine you would be.
Yeah.
They're not given lightly, life memberships.
No, well, I received that because I was the founder of the Orchid Circle in Newcastle.
Do you think now, as you walk through the orchids at your orchid vale there in Wallsend, do you think you've achieved everything that you'd set out to plan for?
Yes, I've achieved a full old age. Now, I can sit back now, I've got enough to interest me always. No matter how long I live, I've just got to go up there and I walk amongst those plants. I'm back where I started. I'm back with the whole life of those orchids right through.
Yeah, you're a real enigma, you know, because you sit there cool and calm, and yet what about that digression with all the fast motorbikes you had and speedboats?
Well, I used to love me motorbikes and I love me speedboats. They always proclaimed in Wallsend that I'd never reach 20. But most of them that proclaimed that, well, they've gone and I'm still here. It's like having my cigarette. They all tell me it'll kill me someday.
In order with your high blood pressure, I believe.
Well, yes, I've got very high blood pressure, but I love me cigarette. And if it doesn't kill me, something else will, so why worry?
I think what nearly could wipe you out was that nickname. They tell me you were called Duty, is it?
Oh, yes.
How did you get that?
Well, there was only 14 months difference between my elder brother and myself, and he couldn't say George. Duty, that was as close as he could get. And that stuck to me ever since. For 70 years, that nickname stuck to me.
You're really an incredible person, George. Right?
Oh, well.
I mean, a man that could say that at the closing stages of life that he has really achieved total contentment. I mean, people have been searching for that for generations.
Well, all my brothers have gone overseas. They've all had trips overseas, brothers, brother-in-laws, sisters. But I never ever want to go out of Wallsend until they take me to Beresfield. But I've been in Wallsend for 70 years. I'll stay there now. That's if the council lets me. The way they've got rates going up, it's going to be that high, we'll all have to get out in the bush.
Well, some of your orchids are you just swap it for the rates, George. They're absolutely beautiful, and most people in the Hunter Valley, of course, understand that. Congratulations on a lifetime of service to orchid lovers and growers and people who just appreciate fine things. Our thanks for you today.
Well, thank you, Ron.
Welcome back to the Valley's people. You know, one of the most fascinating things about this series has been the fact that so many of the guests have been the only one of its kind in Australia. And we've said that about world champions, we've said that about people who've got special interests. And the second guest today is one of those people in that category, because she is the only person in Australia as a professor in the Faculty of Medicine who specialises in something that we all have to face at one stage or other in our life, and that is bereavement. In fact, she's made such a study of it, she's renowned as one of the experts, certainly in the world, of this, I hope, fascinating subject of death, if you can describe it like that. Professor Beverley, Raphael,
yes.
Welcome to the Valley's people.
Thank you, Ron.
I notice immediately that you're not in a traditional dark grey or black uniform. Does that
No.
suggest something about your attitude to death and bereavement?
Well, I suppose it suggests that black and grey are part of the ritual of grief and things we connect with death, but that knowing about death and working with it doesn't necessarily make one feel black and grey the whole time.
Right. I guess not too many people would know that you're so honoured in your profession that you were sort of plucked out immediately at the time of the Granville train disaster to be sent to Sydney to, I guess, comfort or otherwise study a mass bereavement situation. Could you describe what that meant to you at that stage?
Yes. Well, I was actually working in Sydney at that time, and we had, with the College of Psychiatrists, hoped to provide better support services for people who were facing major disasters. And so when the Granville disaster came, we were called in to set up a team of support workers at the city morgue. And we worked there throughout the whole of the first 48 hours with a team of psychiatrists and social workers who had special training and skills to help bereaved people, helping with the identification of the bodies, going in with family members who had come to see the people who had been, they believed to have been injured or killed in the disaster. And we spent time both at the morgue itself providing an immediate support service, and then afterwards in the western suburbs and mountain areas of Sydney, trying to help the other health workers and professionals so that they could learn how to support and handle the bereaved people, the bereaved families who were left behind after that disaster. It was a very massive thing, of course, and so many people dying at one time, I think, was enormously stressful for everyone.
Does it worry you that we're doing an interview on death? Because
No.
it seems ridiculous that I should be asking about your hobbies when you're in such an area.
No, I think I see it as a very important area. You know, I think it's an area that people in Anglo-Saxon culture have avoided, and that many of the migrant groups and people from other countries tend to face this more openly than we do. They're less afraid of their emotions, their feelings about it. We tend to feel it's something that must be avoided at all costs. And of course, we'd all like to stay alive, but inevitably we will die one day, and inevitably we face the loss of those we love. And I think the more open and honest we can be about it and our feelings about it, the more comfortable life becomes.
Yeah, I guess some people might find it odd that it isn't really a science, that you are studying it.
Yes.
And also, I noticed that you've been guest speaker at funeral directors' conventions.
right,
Now, apart
yes.
from the fact I didn't know they had a convention, I
Yes.
just wonder what you talk about to
Yes.
funeral directors from out Australia.
Well, a variety of things, I guess. They too are very anxious to know what they can do to help bereaved people. I think we're now just realising that not only is bereavement, losing someone close to you, very upsetting,
Yes.
distressing and stressful, but it really can have many long-term consequences, leading to depression, health problems, things like that. And so the funeral directors really wanted to know what they could do at that early time to help the acutely bereaved people. And we talked about things like the sort of funeral that might be helpful, ways of letting the bereaved family members see the body of someone who had died. That's a very important thing, for instance.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What, seeing the body laid out is important?
Well, not necessarily being laid out, but at some stage, particularly where death's been a sudden, accidental one, unanticipated in any way, it's very hard for family members to adjust when the person went out well in the morning and they've never seen them again, as with the Granville disaster, for instance, or an accidental death. And so we find that it's very helpful where families can be supported and comforted to see the person after the death, to sort of say another goodbye, to see them as a dead person. And sometimes that's the funeral director's role, sometimes it's something that happens at the hospital. But we do know that it helps a lot with adjustment, even though it is distressing at the time.
Yes, I didn't want to see my father's body after death, but I'm glad I did.
Yes, that's how most people feel, and we know that if you can support people, you know, stay with them, let them cry, comfort them through it, that afterwards they feel, just as you've described, that painful as it was, it's a relief. It's something about the reality of death that they can then face and put aside eventually.
I guess the bereaved widow is the most common sight, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Some people say that it's one of the difficulties that women face in their development, particularly in the latter part of their lives, that they look forward to widowhood because it is more frequent, and it isn't a matter of looking forward to it. There's a lot of sadness and loneliness in widowhood. I think that, you know, in terms of the common image of bereavement, that's the person we think of, and there's an enormous distress and loneliness in it for the woman who's involved.
Yes. You would have studied most of the attitudes, I guess, to death
Yes.
through the years. Would it be right to say that the totally dependent wife in a family situation
Yes.
is also the loneliest widow? Or is that too simplistic?
Well, there are many factors we know that come into it, and certainly the person who's very isolated and dependent, who's just perhaps close to the one person who's died, finds it very hard after they've gone. It's as though their whole world has been wiped out. We know, for instance, that if you've got a supportive group of friends and close family members with whom you can share your grief, you know, can cry, remember the good and bad things about the person who's gone, then that does tend to help you adjust. And I think the very dependent wife, when widowed, finds that there is often no one else round to turn to, and she feels particularly lost.
Yes, in the family situation, and again from your studies, does a male or a female adjust any easier?
Well, I think this comes back to some of the social and cultural values we have. People tend to say that men should have a stiff upper lip and be strong and comfort the wife. And I think men have intense grief in their hearts, but the social role for them is to be the strong ones the ones who don't cry, who don't show any open feeling. Most studies suggest that women show a higher level of grief, and perhaps for a longer period. But a lot suggests that inside men feel just as much. It's just it isn't all right for them to say so, but they have to keep it to themselves, and perhaps it comes out in other ways.
Anglo-Saxon traditions once
That's
again.
right, yes.
Yes, that's incredible. The thought that you've made a study of this just prompts this next question, which you really don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I'm just wondering in my mind, could you paint the perfect funeral? I mean, what is it now that you think people should do?
Well, I think the more simplicity and honesty about a funeral, the better, and the more the family themselves, the most involved close members of the family, can be supported to sort out what they want, the better the funeral will be. I think, first of all, it's important for family members, including young children, to be able to visit the parlour or see the body as part of the funeral service if appropriate. It depends, of course, on one's beliefs, but it does seem that people often choose cremation because it's less emotionally disturbing, and perhaps that's not the best thing in the long run, that the reality of a burial may mean more and be easier in the long run to come to terms with than the mystery of cremation and the sudden vanishing of the body. I think a funeral service which allows for everybody to have their own particular memories of the dead person, not painting a eulogised picture of them, but rather saying he was a person you'll all remember in different ways. Sometimes there'll be happy memories, sometimes there'll be sad memories, sometimes there'll be good memories, sometimes bad. I think I see those as the chief criteria. A service which allows grief and feeling, the real feeling about this person, to come out. I know in many cultures there is much more allowance for family members to handle the body and to take an active part in the funeral. And I think there's also more acceptance of the appropriateness of external things like crying and distress. And I think the more we can allow those to be natural and accepted and nothing to be ashamed of, the better.
But we tend to pop a pill to stop that, don't
Yes,
we?
unfortunately we do, and every evidence we have from our studies is that that's very adverse in the long run.
Really?
Yes, that it puts the person in an emotional straitjacket and locks their grief inside, and that leads to a range of illnesses. It can even disturb your immune systems and make you more prone to infections, and we have been able to show that in some very excellent studies carried out in Australia. So I think we really know that grief needs to find its way out. That's not to say you can force it if you don't feel like it, but we should stop doing the things that interfere, like popping pills and advising someone to get sedated and not to see the body and not to think about the past, because all those things are part of the process of adjustment, and painful as it is, the sooner we are able to do those with the support of others, the more we will ultimately adjust to the loss.
Do I read you correctly in saying in that scenario that you painted there that the people that were around the graveside many years ago on the top of a hill with a little wooden cross, actually watching the casket go into the ground, may have been able to adjust faster than someone in a streamlined cremation setting? Is that right? You were saying that?
Yes. On the surface, it may look just the opposite. For example, everybody praises the widow who's been to the funeral and doesn't cry and says how wonderful she was,
Yes.
she didn't break down, isn't she coping well? But the evidence is, from many psychiatric studies, that she may look fine now, but the problems will occur and recur over the months and weeks that follow. And that will create more difficulties for her than if she had been able to have that pain and mourning, that external ritual accepted and the emotional part of it released earlier on.
Now, Professor, you've become chairperson of the centre which is actually to study this work of bereavement and death. It will be attached to the Mater Hospital, correct, at the Faculty of
Yes.
Medicine? What will it achieve?
Well, this is a centre for preventive psychiatry, and its aim is in working with a number of very stressful life situations like bereavement, like serious accidents, like having something wrong with your baby when it's born, all those sorts of situations, to provide supportive counselling and supportive backup to the people who are involved in care, so that undue psychiatric problems will be prevented, so that depression won't arise in the way it might otherwise. And this centre is aimed at establishing services which prevent psychiatric problems, and as such it's the first in Australia.
Another first for the Hunter Valley.
Yes, that's
This program
right.
discovered a lot of that as we've gone through
Yes.
these last few weeks. Professor Beverley, Raphael, I thank you, and I think that most people would tend to suggest that you're in a study of which there is no end, if I can use that term,
Yes.
because we all must face the thing that you're studying. It's not something that's remote from any of us, is
No,
it?
it isn't. It's part of everybody's life.
And how have you mentally adjusted to that?
Well, there have been times when I've found it very stressful, I'm sure, and times where I've very much valued my family's backup and the workers who've worked with me. But I've found over the years that I'm sure I felt better inside for knowing about it and facing it than I would have if I'd tried to put the blinkers on, as we usually do.
And are you preparing yourself now for that bereavement?
For mine, I think that it's something you think about a lot more when you work in the field. And I think one of the things that some of the workers at the Granville disaster said to us when we explored how they felt afterwards, that if you come close to death and bereavement, then you reevaluate your life a lot more, and you really place a lot more importance on the relationships and the things that are vital to you in your family life. And so I think that you get a richer life out of facing death than you do out of avoiding it.
Professor Beverley Raphael, we honour your work, and to you. Thanks for joining us
today.
today.
Thank you very much indeed, Ron.
Two guests today. Firstly, from Wall's End, Mr. George Rundle, 50 years an orchid grower, an Australian champion orchid grower at that. And also Professor Beverley Raphael, who is the first chairperson of the Centre for Preventive Psychiatry, which is to be attached to the Faculty of Medicine at the Mater Hospital, working on bereavement and death in our society. Hope you've enjoyed today's show and that you'll join us again for another program of the Valley's People. Goodbye for now.